NFL draft combine was over the weekend. Started looking at this in terms of the schools that showed out. All the school accounts always want to brag about all the players that they have. So I'm going to run down some of the totals, the higher totals that we have. And speaking of Ohio State, I want to ask, how concerned should we be? And you can say very concerned, not concerned at all, about replacing all of this talent. So Ohio State had 15 players in the NFL draft combine. It included Will Howard, Travion Henderson, Quinshon Judkins, Emeka Egbuka, Jack Sawyer, Denzel Burke, and so much more. Jordan Hancock, Lathan Ransom, lot of star power there from that national championship team. How concerned are you about the Buckeyes replacing all that NFL draft talent in 2025?
Definitely might finish in fourth.
Right. They might barely get in.
I would have a hard time thinking this team doesn't have a drop-off, but also if you recruit extremely well and you're also still one of the biggest spenders in the sport and you retained a lot of elite talents, it's hard for me to who jumps them in the Big Ten?
Illinois. I think it is a concern. I think it is fine to be concerned, but that is only in a myopic vacuum where the only thing that exists is Ohio State and its own standard of being Ohio State. I think the second you take those blinders off and compare them to everybody else and all the other teams at the national level and in the Big Ten that are also replacing pieces, I think you're probably less concerned.
But they won a national title, so yeah, there's probably going to be a drop-off because they're probably not going to win the national title again. But I look at this from a situation where I've seen a lot of comparisons because of what happened at Michigan. Like Michigan loaded up, went all in, won a national title, and then completely collapsed last year. But there was so much more that went into that other than just the players leaving. Like Jim Harbaugh and the entire staff leaves. And I know Ohio State's lost its coordinators, but you've got Ryan Day and a bunch of that staff still returning, and they have recruited very, very well. And there's also, Julian Sayin might be better than Will Howard as a quarterback. We don't know yet. That's not
that combine performance.
It's not like there's a very small chance. There's a decent chance that Julian Sayin is a better quarterback than Will Howard. He's not as experienced. He's likely to make more mistakes than Will Howard made, but you've still got Jeremiah Smith. You've still got really talented rosters. So while they might not be as good, they're still going to be one of the better teams in the Big Ten. They're still going to be competing for the Big Ten title, and they're still going to be competing for a playoff berth, I think, at a minimum. I don't think it's quite the same situation as I've seen it compared to with Michigan.
Yeah.
Their best player on offense, Jeremiah Smith, is back. You could argue their best player on defense, Caleb Downs, is back. I totally agree with you. I thought Will Howard, he was underrated, probably didn't get enough credit for some of the play that he did have, but I do think they could get upgraded. And I think one of the reasons I think they're the top two, sometimes some books have them the favorite to win the national championship, is, by the way, while they're figuring all this out with this incredible inexperienced talent that's going to be playing, they can lose a game or two. Mm-hmm. And they're 10-2 and they're in. And shoot, if you're 10-2 and in, you might not even have to play in the Big Ten championship game. Get a bye week going in and a home game again. So I think that's the most way I could make the most sense of it. And it's if they're not, what's the level of concern of who's going to pass them? Like you guys said.
Yeah, if they lose that Texas game early in the year, they'll have more meaningful games to play later.
Right.
Yeah, they're probably going to finish higher in the conference
than they did this year. You want to talk about dedication? James said, "Does Danny have a studio in his automobile?" He stays ready.
Definitely.
Okay,
I do. I have a wrap. I have a wrap with the Cover 3 logos around, so I'm always advertising the show. I got all these buttons, full control room in here, pressing all the buttons. Got the monitors ready. We're good.
Then I heard,
are they really listening from the amplifiers? They list saying at 6'1", 203. Really?
Do you think he's bigger?
No.
Okay.
He's skinny.
Speaking of the Texas Longhorns,
Senior Bowl had him at 225.
Yeah, that's right.
Ohio State and Texas at the top of a lot of the odds boards, top of the way too early list. Also at the top of the list of schools producing the most NFL draft combine invites. The Texas Longhorns had 14 players invited. We mentioned Jahdae Barron on Monday. We mentioned Matthew Golden, also Quinn Ewers, Kelvin Banks, a lot more to this group. How concerned are you about Texas replacing all this?
Relatively low. I think that they lost some really good college players, but like Bond had an underwhelming combine to a certain extent. And Barron is a really good college player. I guess I have some concern about the offensive line. There were some guys at the combine who said that Texas was really pushing the narrative, which is probably true, that Quinn Ewers was actually a lot more hurt than he was let on. And if you go back and watch the Michigan game after which he got hurt, that Michigan game, he actually played extremely well. And like not just they scored well, but like he himself played well. So the drop off from the version of Quinn Ewers that Texas had in 2024 to the version of Arch Manning that they should have in 2025, and it's speculative because we don't really know what he's going to be. I think that drop off is going to be pretty small if there's anyone at all. In fact, I think Arch Manning will be better this year than Quinn Ewers was for the majority of 24. I don't know if Arch Manning is going to be better than how Quinn would have been had he stayed healthy the whole year. I don't know, but they did not go after anybody in the portal. Like they knew it was Arch. So I do read into that. Much like Ohio State was not super serious about anybody behind the scenes, at least to my knowledge, in the portal. Unless Quinn wanted to come back, and I think there would have been interest there. Obviously.
Yeah, I have concerns about them at the tackle spot, but it's also mitigated by the fact that they've recruited the lines of scrimmage extremely well the last few years.
Goolsby looked okay when he got
Goolsby looked good when he got thrown in there. And then also I just think that the offense they play is beneficial to their offensive linemen. Like I know I've heard the stat about Kelvin Banks. How many sacks did he allow in his career? Well, how many times was the quarterback holding the ball more than 1 second in that offense? And it's RPO kind of stuff. So it's just I think that the style they play and the talent they have, they should be fine. My concern for Texas wouldn't be so much the talent that they lost and have to replace as much as it's the schedule they're going to face in the teams in their league.
But they do get gifted very similarly to what was last year. They don't have to play Ole Miss. They don't have to play LSU. They don't have to play Tennessee. They do play Florida. They do play Georgia again in Athens, but there's a little bit of leeway there. They get Oklahoma, Vanderbilt, Arkansas, Texas A&M at home. And I know they're playing Ohio State, but they still do have 3 cupcakes on there as well right after that game. So they'll have like a big test week 1. They'll figure out, all right, what are the problems we have? Arch Manning, if he plays great, it's awesome. If he doesn't, you kind of get him back up to confidence, his confidence up, work on the things you need to work on the next 3 games, and then you're kind of into the conference schedule.
You mentioned that, Bud, going back to what you said earlier about like Florida State and Clemson and their home schedules and looking at the SEC. Here's Texas's home schedule. Tell me how excited you are to buy season tickets this year. San Jose State, UTEP, Sam Houston State, Vanderbilt, Arkansas, and then the A&M game. Because remember, Oklahoma's at a neutral site. It's at the Cotton Bowl. So that is, wow. I can't wait to spend all that money to go see those teams.
Sponsored by Corona.
Who are the roadies? Georgia, Florida,
Ohio State, Kentucky, Mississippi State, Florida, and Georgia.
I mean, that's a pretty good road slate, but obviously you're right with the season tickets.
Yeah.
Texas could really benefit from 9 SEC games this year.
SEC was a little bit lazy with their scheduling when they just decided to flip everything from 2024 to 2025. We'll worry about the rest later. Is it just switch sides? You two switch sides. Okay. The Georgia Bulldogs also had 14 players invited to the NFL Draft Combine. That group includes Trevor Etienne, Michael Williams. We did talk about Malachi Starks. We talked about Tate Ratledge, Jalen Walker also headlining that group. How concerned are you about Georgia replacing its NFL draft talent?
They're used to it. I mean, if anybody is used to it, it's Georgia. I mean, they're rattling off double-digit draft picks, every year for what, 3 or 4 years now at minimum.
I don't know that they're developing and recruiting offensive linemen at quite the unbelievably unsustainable clip they were, maybe a half decade ago. So that's a bit of a concern, but they also had a lot of injuries this year. So I think if you just kind of have some positive regression on the offensive line injury front, you're probably going to be better up there next year. Receiver, given the fact they had to dismiss 2 kids like post portal closing, or well, one was dismissed, one was just kind of permanently off. They're going to be better there, I think. I mean, you lose Dom Lovett and like a guy in Arian Smith, who we were like, this is a gadget guy who they're having to put into the starting lineup because of some of the injury stuff and some of the behavior and dismissal stuff. So I think they'll be better.
Yeah, like last year's Georgia team was so inconsistent, and it's weird. It's what we'll find out in 2025 was 2024 just like an off year, or was it the start of something?
Because they only lost by 1 score to Alabama in the 2023 season. And for a lot of the rest of the year, they looked awesome. So we'll see if what last year was. The Oregon Ducks, 13 players. Dylan Gabriel, we talked about. Tez Johnson, we talked about. Also Derek Harmon, Josh Connolly, a lot more. Oregon replacing 13 players who are off to the NFL draft combine and part of the NFL draft process. How are we feeling about the Ducks replacing that talent?
I have more concern about them than I do Ohio State.
And Ohio State and Georgia and Texas have been at this for just a little bit, a few more cycles. And Dan Lanning's doing it right.
He is. And it's when you look at what they've done, like they are recruiting very well, but they've also had the cycle where they've had consistently veteran quarterback play. As of right now, they won't have that going into next season. Then you combine it with the talent that they lost. There won't be a lot of veterans at other key spots on the field for them to rely on. So I do think I don't think they're going to be bad by any stretch in the imagination, but undefeated regular season, winning the Big Ten again, I don't think that's in the cards.
Oregon fans are real convinced Dante Moore is like a dude, and he might be.
He might be.
I think it's certainly possible that they definitely like him. If not, like Austin Novosad, maybe could play at a decent level. Maybe Moore is better than Gabriel. We don't really know. It's possible. I mean, you lose.
He's more gifted.
Tez. Yeah. I'm a little bit concerned about receiver in some ways. Like some of the guys who they've signed, and like are they just ever going to get? It's not really their fault. Like they just have not been able to get healthy. But I mean, Holden was the number 3 for them last year, and he's gone. You lose a tight end in Ferguson, who like a lot of people really loved, and you lose Herbert as well, who played a whole bunch. And I like Kenyon Sadiq quite a bit at tight end. Like the guy they threw 2 or 3 touchdowns to in the Big Ten championship game. You got to return, or you got to replace a lot of offensive line, a whole lot. Defensively, you lose both those D tackles. You win. Like that was a hit last year. They paid a ton of money for those guys, and it was well worth it. Replacing those dudes isn't easy. I don't know they're totally turnkey, especially because I think this year's portal was rough, and they also lost their top. I think their top 6 DBs by snap count.
5 or I think it's 5, but it might be 6.
Because they were old, right? I mean,
yeah, that's what I'm saying. This was a veteran team.
Yeah.
And now you're not going to be the veteran team. So, and then also let's look at last year's schedule. Like this was their road slate was Oregon State, UCLA, Purdue, Michigan, which we know was not your typical Michigan, and then Wisconsin at the end of the season. And that team was just a dead team walking by that point. This year, they've got to go. It's not a monster, but they've got to go on the road to play Penn State this year. They've got to go on the road to finish the season at Washington. Iowa could be better. Rutgers is not going to be an easy trip for them. So it's just, they're still probably going to be a top 4 team in the league. They're still likely to be competing for a playoff spot all year, but I just don't think that I don't think it's realistic to think they'll be as good as they were last year.
Like no Ohio State, no Michigan. You do get Minnesota at home, you get USC at home. I think the trip to Washington for the Apple Cup is still, or not the Apple Cup, the Civil War is kind of difficult. But you get Oregon State, you get Northwestern, as you mentioned. I don't know. Like, if you're Oregon, you should not be having any trouble with Rutgers now. I get your point. I think that's a tough cross-country road trip. But I think if you're an Oregon fan, you're like, with what we're donating and what we're spending, like we should not be having any trouble with Rutgers.
True. Coming up on the other side, we have just given you a couple of schools that were all in the college football playoff and had double-digit players invited to the NFL Draft Combine. What about some teams that came just close and now also have to replace double-digit players? All that and more next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, the Ole Miss Rebels had 11 players tied for fourth among all schools in the entire country in terms of players invited to the NFL Draft Combine. Jackson Dart, who we have talked about a lot in the quarterback battle, but also, your Walter Nolans, also Trey Harris, and so much more. What's our level of concern? Danny, what's our level of concern with Ole Miss replacing all this talent?
This is the Portal King, right? I mean, aren't they up there again in the transfer portal rankings where you are kind of used to a lot of this turnover? I do think, similar to Oregon, a little concerned about the quarterback. I mean, because there is some uncertainty there. You've had really good, solid play from Jackson Dart. There's not an Arch Manning waiting in the wing. So that's probably the biggest concern for me. But I do think Lane Kiffin has thrived in this era of, roster turnover, getting players up to speed quickly in a system that is very friendly. So, but I think the bigger question is, it did feel like last year was the window to get there and they still came up short. So if you're asking me projecting, I would say they're probably not a playoff team next year based on that. If they couldn't get it done the way things were, the stars were aligned last year, I'd be surprised if they made it this year.
Yep. My level of concern is always going to be higher for a team that's built the way Ole Miss is played or built. Like any kind of portal heavy team, I'm always going to be higher concerned about the replacements because it's just so hit or miss for a lot of these things. And I do have questions about what this Rebels team will look like. But the one thing that works in their favor, again, is the same thing as you mentioned, Chip. They just kind of flip-flop schedules on everybody. So Ole Miss had a favorable schedule last year. And guess what? They've got a pretty favorable schedule again this year. Like their road slate starts with, they're at Kentucky. They would never lose at Kentucky. At home, maybe, but never on the road. You get Georgia and Oklahoma on the road and Mississippi State, but their home slate is Georgia State, Arkansas, Tulane, LSU, Wazoo, South Carolina, Citadel, Florida, maybe. So, I still think they're going to be in that 8-4, 9-3 range.
I tend to agree, and I like Austin Simmons, but when I look at some of these computer stuff, there is a bit of a way you can game it, not huge, but I think Ole Miss games it a little bit in some of these advanced metrics, and that is because they do try to run it up a ton on the bad teams. They still go fast. They still try to chuck it deep on these bad teams, and I think these computer systems early on in the season, that their definition of garbage time is a little bit too broad for my taste when it comes to capturing the true power of some of these teams who want to run it up on people like crazy. I mean, they beat Furman 75-0. They beat Middle Tennessee 52-3 and are throwing late, right? They beat Wake 40-6. They beat Georgia Southern 52-13, and they lose to Kentucky, a team that has at least some athletes who are going to go to the combine, right? They beat South Carolina when Carolina didn't have Sellers. Isn't that an Ashford game? I think 27-3. Then they lose at LSU. They play like crap against Oklahoma and win 26-14. They did crush Arkansas. At Arkansas. I mean, I don't recall the circumstance of that game. But was that the one that the Arkansas quarterback missed?
I don't remember.
He got hurt.
Banged up.
He was banged up, and it was just it was not a white flag game, but we weren't walking away with strong takes one way or the other. It was not a competitive ball game.
And then they crushed Georgia, to their credit. I mean, it was a weird weather game, but they absolutely they handled business really well there. They go and they lay an absolute egg off a bye, by the way, at Florida in the Swamp. They beat Mississippi State in a game that wasn't super impressive, and they run it up on Duke, and Duke didn't have a quarterback. So I don't know. I don't think the drop off has to be quite as big as maybe it might be projected to be, but I'm also not sure this team was all that good last year. I think they had some good players, but I think they just beat a lot of really bad teams by a ton. And there's some signal in that, but I think you can kind of overfit to that signal. And I think Ole Miss is the prime candidate there.
Well, also Danny, you mentioned the Portal King did it again. He's got 22 transfer portal players, and 24/7 Sports has him as a top 5 transfer portal class. But man, you start to dig in, and we get to our conversation about what the level of talent was in the transfer portal. It's all relative, and it's like, congrats, you've got a top 5 transfer portal class. But Harrison Wallace from Penn State is one of your most highly rated transfer portal additions. You lose a lot off of the defensive line. And look, you got You got Prince Will Ellen, like that's good. Like he was at Nebraska last year. He's a talented player, but I think replacing everything that you had in terms of the interior defensive line, the bodies that you had, the experience that you had, I don't think this is going to be a group that leads the nation in sacks like it did this past season. I think I am concerned about Ole Miss replacing all of the talent that they lost off this team.
I mean, to your point, let's take the number 5 class from last year and tell me you wouldn't rather have that class than the number 1 class this year. So Texas pulls Makuba, Trey Moore, Matthew Golden, Silas Bolden, Blackshear, Isaiah Bond, Amari Nyblack, 2 defensive linemen in Norton and Jermaine Lowell who actually contribute on a team that made the Final Four. Like, yeah, I don't think that the portal talent this year was nearly as good overall.
Yeah, there's no Walter Nolan in their transfer class this year.
Yeah, that's 100%.
I think they're good at scouting. Like, I think Ole Miss does do a good job of kind of like picking up rocks and seeing what's under there. But it ain't nothing under there. It's just, it kind of is what it is.
The South Carolina Gamecocks had 11 players invited to the NFL Draft Combine. We talked about Nick Emanwari as one of the superstars of the entire NFL Draft Combine. So that was something that stood out. But you go into it and you see that this is like the whole South Carolina defense. I mean, 8 of the 11 players that were selected. Be safe out there, Danny. 8 of the 11 players that were selected.
The background is suddenly moving.
8 of the 11 players that were invited, not selected, but invited to the NFL Draft Combine were from the defensive side of the ball. Lenore Sellers can't play defense.
No, he cannot. That's a good observation.
Thanks. I'm a professional.
They lost like grown ass men off that team who were old. I mean, Kyle Kennard played his butt off for them. 10 sacks, 23 hurries, 18 stops. Tonka Hemingway, TJ Sanders combined for 38 stops. Like that. I mean, DeAndre Jules played a role for them this year. He's gone too. It just feels like they lost a ton on the front. They had a bunch of like really good college linebackers. I don't know if those guys are going to be studs in the NFL, but not super easy to replace. I know a couple teams I spoke with thought that the linebackers available in the portal this year were absolute dog shit. It's like, man, if you need a backer this year in the portal, you're in real trouble. And they have to replace 3 of them. I mean, Knight, Williams, and Bam. That's a lot to replace, man. And I think the secondary could maybe improve with some of the young guys growing up, but losing him and worry, that's a big deal too. I totally buy that the edge rusher Dylan Stewart and obviously Sellers could take a big step forward. I mean, Tom and I watched that bowl game. I was there in person. I mean, Illinois had him. His head was spinning. He was having real trouble reading coverages, and he's very, very athletic, but I don't think he actually does a great job of avoiding sacks relative to pressure, and that's something that's got to improve. Like he can make people miss, but also I think he runs himself into some sacks at times. And I think he could get so much better, but also, man, like this team ran good in some of these games really well. Like they were number 1 in the nation in 4th down defense. That's not something that's super crazy repeatable overall. They were really good in the red zone. I'm like, man, the Sellers and Dylan Stewart could get better.
Sure.
Significantly so. And this team could be nowhere near as good as it was last year.
And like another thing that works against them too, like we talked about it with Ole Miss and Texas, how their schedules are easy. Well, guess what, man? South Carolina's schedule was hard as hell last year. And guess what? It's hard as hell again this year. Like the start of it, not terrible because you're starting with Virginia Tech, South Carolina State, Vandy, Mizzou, Kentucky. Mizzou's the only one of those on the road. But then the back half of the schedule is LSU on the road, Oklahoma, Alabama, at Ole Miss, at A&M, Coastal thrown in as I guess your FCS bye this season. And then you finish with Clemson. So like it's hard to imagine that team's going to win 9 games again.
Yeah. Totally. Almost everybody who they play, I think, will project to have better quarterback play as well. I mean, Vandy has like 30-year-old Pavia.
Is that including Nuss just being better, I guess?
Sure. Now, they do dodge. They don't have to play Lagway, and they don't have to play Arch Manning.
Right.
And that helps. And I don't think Kentucky's primed for a bounce back at all. So, like, the opening of this schedule is pretty friendly. If South Carolina is as good as their fans think it's going to be, they better start 5-0. Like, you better go win in Blacksburg. You better, like, Vandy better not be real competitive. At Missouri, like, if you think this is a legitimate playoff team, you need to win that ballgame at Missouri. Because the back half is not real easy.
Can't do the T
It's-
thing anymore.
I mean,
That's right.
that's right.
They go to LSU, host Oklahoma, host Bama, at Ole Miss, at A&M, get Coastal, which is nice, and then you host Clemson.
Mm-hmm.
Before we get to this last one on here, driving bets.
We probably need to make a rule that, like, I don't really. If Danny's doing that, he needs to be driving the Tesla because it means the Tesla's driving him.
I don't think, like, unless Danny's driving down a bumpy road, I don't know if driving bets has the same appeal as like maybe walking bets would.
All right, the Miami Hurricanes.
Wait, hold on a second. What about pass catchers for South Carolina? Like
Wells
Josh Simon went to the combine.
Yep.
He was their go-to guy. Like, they forced him the ball and he made it pay off. I don't like is Nick Harbor going to be something finally?
So here's my
fantasy team hopes so.
My thought with South Carolina and with a few other places where I'm looking at like the supposed absence of receptions or targets. I do think that when you have a player who's going to command so much attention from the back half of the defense, that you are going to be able to take a Jag or a Jag plus and be able to give them not first team all conference level production, but like, I don't know, second, third team all conference level production, SEC wide receiver of the week, October 15th, kind of games. So because you are not going to be asking the same kind of contested catch, one-on-one play type of stuff, because you're just not going to see it as much with the player of Sellers' gifted ability. I think South Carolina could be okay there.
Makes sense. They also didn't take anybody in the portal at receiver. So if you want to read into action or inaction as signal, maybe that means that internally they like some of these young guys at receiver. Yeah. Like, I don't think their receivers really scared anybody last year. It was Simon was the guy.
Speaking of force feed, what are we going to do without Xavier Restrepo? Oh, God. That guy. For years, for multiple quarterbacks, for multiple coaches. Wait, maybe multiple. Wasn't he a freshman the last year of Manny?
Yeah.
I thought he was a 4-year player. I could be wrong about that. But Xavier Restrepo's target share has allowed him to become the most productive wide receiver in Miami football history. So
call him the best.
The best, sure.
There you go.
Miami had 10 players invited to the NFL Draft Combine that included Xavier Restrepo, but also Cam Ward and many more. What is your concern level? Obviously, we know what we're doing with the quarterback position with Carson Beck stepping in. But what about the rest of that group and Miami's talent coming back? How much concern there?
A lot of concern over leadership on offense.
Is that because of the Cam Ward, like what he meant for the culture?
That's just from, like, I was, Orlando, Bradenton, Tampa, Miami, a couple other stops over the last week on the recruiting circuit. That's what came up a couple times. It's just like talking to people who I trust. The leadership is the concern. Like losing Cam, losing Restrepo, losing some guys who had been there a while who cared. And I don't think that's a shot at Carson Beck, but maybe it is. I don't know.
I think that's a maybe, okay. But I think it's a compliment to Cam Ward.
Agreed.
I mean, that was the story going into the fall, where it's like, and I always roll I shouldn't always roll my eyes, but like I sometimes roll my eyes when somebody feeds me. It's like, and this quarterback, man, Chip, he's got the wide receivers getting together and they're just doing drills themselves. I mean, they're so motivated right now. But that sort of thing was like the big like Cam Ward narrative, and the Cam Ward story was like how all in he got everybody else on that offense, that as soon as he got to Miami, he was the biggest voice and he was driving people and inspiring people. And like, that was something that sure is going to be missed.
Defensively, they should be better.
Yes.
It'd be hard not to.
Hard to be.
Yeah, philosophy-wise, they should be better. I don't even know if it's an upgraded talent as much as it's just going to be, hey, let's use common sense on the defensive side of the ball. I have concerns about them, but they're alleviated by the conference that they play in. I do think they're going to be the best team on the field most weeks. Like they have to play Notre Dame. Won't be easy. Florida won't be easy. We'll see at Florida State. But for the most part, you look at that schedule and it's like, I'm not saying they won't have tough games, but by and large, still feel like they're better than the teams they're playing.
I think that's fair.
But also, like, we don't know what Carson Beck looks like.
We at least saw clips of him out there doing like the rotations.
Mm-hmm.
Dak Prescott
Basically,
yeah,
thrusting them hips out there.
It's like there's typically there's positive results from this surgery on quarterbacks. It does not have the same kind of impact on them that it has on a pitcher. But you never know. Like that's the thing. Like, will he be tentative throwing it because he's afraid to just really let it go?